Her confirming glance back to the band disturbed her otherwise remarkable stillness. The musicians pressed their hands to their instruments and took a deep breath. Cassandra took a deep breath. The harpist threaded out a wavering staccato melody whose last lonely note faded into silence. Two drummers, seated cross-legged and leaned back to back, picked up the tune that had just been tickled out. The larger of the two reached over the elbow of the smaller. Both worked together to reach every drum. Cassandra's heel crashed to the floor with the first beat. The soles of her shoes clattered in unison with the padded drums, but her gestures seemed to deviate from the music, as though she moved to a melody that was almost her own. She twisted around and wove her hands through the air, lifted them up and pushed them out. A glittering luminous smoke trailed from her fingers. The astounded audience gawked with hypnotized fascination as the princess spun the strands of shining wisp. With a thrust hip and a pounded stomp forward, the hands came to frame her hips, which popped and twisted in the music's momentary pause. She stepped forward as another set of beats were drummed out, then proceeded to dance across the low dining tables whose lacquer tops were even with the stage. The harpist and drummers had defined the melody well by the time the remaining musicians chimed in. A pair of children who framed the band shook stemmed metal bowls dressed with beaded nets. They kept a steady, high-pitched pace for the other musicians to follow. A tall, silver-haired woman, covered head to toe in swirling blue tattoos, sat beside the dark-skinned harpist. She held a row of bronze bells on a long rod, which cried a short, high chime when struck. Longer, deeper tones moaned when she tapped the small gongs attached to the bell's hammers. Two flautists, a brother and a sister, then added another dimension to the existing staccato melody. They whispered across the mouths of their instruments while their fingers danced along the shafts. Their duet was a violent competition to see which could squeal higher, play lower, sweep faster, or warble stronger. The flute song ignited the glittering smoke that wafted from the princess's hands. The pitch of the whistling matched the pitch with which the sparks burned away the curling trails of wisp, and the princess's previously awkward gestures at last synchronized with the rest of the music. Her hips, whipped with the melody, lashed across the harp. Her feet stomped with the beat, patted on the drums. Each strike of the bell struck Cassandra into a new pose. The flute sang the sparks' excitement as they coasted along the trail scratched into existence by the princess's fingers. As the sparks ascended to the zenith of a slope, the flute scaled through several slurred octaves. The tone trembled tenuously as the sparks reached an apex. Cassandra's successive postures had whirled the glittering smoke into a vortex around her. Encased in the luminous strands, she could do little more than shimmy and shudder. She rolled her shoulders, curved her spine, jutted and posed. The flautists were spared one beat for a gasp, then recommenced with a melodic dive. The sparks breached their apex and slid into a whirling drain down the vortex that encased the princess. The flute song descended through every arpeggio of several scales. The accelerating pace of their song accelerated the sparks. As they closed in on Cassandra's hands, the flutes blared one last note. The two sparks crashed as their smoky trails climaxed in Cassandra's clapped hands. Cassandra burst forth from the explosion that spit sparks into the crowd. Her heels chattered as she twisted and lunged her way down the table. The melody changed focus. The harp continued its repertoire, but the drums were held still, their rhythm replaced by the tolling of bells. Cassandra stopped. The bells stopped. A pattern was patted on the drums. The bells chimed. Cassandra danced. The whole pattern was repeated. Tarakon's mouth gaped as he watched her move. He no longer felt guilty for having seen her garter. She was covered by what means he was not sure. Patches of bare skin peeked between the chains of pearls and gold fringe slung across her shoulders and stomach. Her black silk skirt could barely keep from slipping down her thighs, inadvertently exposing the leather bands of her girdle from under her golden, pearl-encrusted belt. The green slivers of jade used to decorate her garter peeked from the slit of her skirt every time she lunged, or spun quickly enough to hike her hem. She neared the intersection of the tables where he sat, simply attired in a gray silk tunic, a ghost among the other peacocks in the dining hall. He was alone and utterly unnoticed, except by her. She towered over him, stared down at him. He gawked, dumbfounded, and in that instant she realized her impression on him. She did compromise his position. He could be praying to her. What is wrong with him? What was wrong with her? She could feel herself forget the steps. The mechanical character of her motion was beginning to jam. Her muscles filled with amnesia. She could feel the beats coming, rushing forward, destined to crash into her if she did not move out of the way. It was not possible. She had practiced this dance too many times. Something had to break if she was to continue. She stole a silent moment between the beats to gather her scattered concentration. It was him. How dare he let her compromise him? She turned on him the full force of her concentrated glare and dared him to stop her. His gawk collapsed into itself, and he turned away. She changed legs, thrust her hip, rolled her pelvis as she turned around. Her sinewy neck pulled and ached as she peeked over her shoulder so as not to lose focus on him. She caught him steal a fragile glance from the corner of his reluctant eye. The flutes hooted another set of layered melodies. Hands smacked the skins that had been mercilessly stretched over the drum's large, round frames. Their pattered rhythm was building. Cassandra twisted her fingers around the black silk that danced around her gilded ankles. She threw her skirt side to side, fanned it open, let it fall, then dragged it across her body to fan it again on the other side. The sound of her heels clattered against the tabletop, then puttered into a series of loud stomps. The melody became frustrated. The tune on the harp began to fray. The steady rhythm of the bells was being broken. Only every third or fourth intended chime was actually struck. Cassandra fanned open her skirt. She took shelter beneath it, curled up within the fabric's folds. Black silk consumed the gold, consumed the blonde. In one beat, the black silk skirt collapsed over the princess. In the next beat, the skirt fanned open at the head of the table, several feet from where Cassandra had disappeared. With a final thrash of drums, Cassandra dropped to one knee before the great hall. The momentum of the flared black skirt wrung itself still around her legs. Her choking on the anticipation of this moment ended the instant the drumming ended on a perfectly timed great last beat. Cassandra exhaled. The tension that was wound taut in every muscle vented with every successive satisfying breath. All that remained was an exhausted husk. There was nothing more to do, and hands were too busy applauding to pick and pull at her. Voices were too busy lauding to whisper their sarcastic comments. She was done. She could take the vacant throne beside her mother. "Magnificent," Osmara whispered with a smile, then stood and lifted her crystal flute, brimming with blue froth. "I raise this toast in celebration of Vernalion, whose sacrifice inspires our lives. I raise this toast to the Order of Vernalion, which reflects in its missions Vernalion's dedication and devotion. Vernalion, stay with us, guide our way. Tawesh Vernalion." Every glass was lifted in praise of the mythic hero. With the toast completed, the dinner commenced. The arched doors at either end of the entrance's landing opened. A fleet of uniformed servants elegantly balanced steaming trays as they descended the steps and drifted around the tables like boats in a harbor. Their maneuvers to avoid one another seemed almost choreographed. Effortlessly and without a word, they lifted trays over each other's heads, presented their delicious wares, served, and then swerved out of the way of the next dish. A plate of steaming translucent noodles was set before Terracon, immediately followed with the presentation of a mountain of garnished oysters. Terracon thrust a fork into the mussels and laid them on the bed of pasta before returning the instrument to the tray. Bowls of exotic fruits swimming in sugary sauces were set sporadically across the tables. Children clamored desperately for the ladles to fish out the sweetest of the caramelized fruits which had sunk to the bottom. Nuts were glazed with honey, roasted and dusted with salt before being served. Thick roots and flowery bulbs ready to blossom were spiced and baked to a char-crusted perfection. A brown egg in a miniature silver goblet was placed next to Terracon's cup. He cracked the shell with a small knife and then poured the hot yolk over a piece of salted lye loaf, which he had plucked from the braid set in the middle of the table. The hungry ruckus grew in volume, and soon the festivities were in full swing. The guests fattened themselves on wyvern fillet and bounced gaily to the chipper and familiar ditties played for their entertainment by the band. Jokes riddled the air with laughter, but the comedians were careful not to make sport of any person present at the tables. Instead, they balked at classic characters and motifs, and the failures of those who had not received an invitation. When it was apparent that everything else scheduled for that evening could be missed without regret, the guests began to depart with as little pomp as their status demanded. Those who remained retreated to the tables in the curtained seclusions behind the pillars, and were lost to private affairs and gossip which spread rampantly behind the fringed velvet panels. If there was any negative repercussion in remaining amid one's own companions rather than the company of foreign dignitaries, it certainly was not noticed after the drapes had been pulled. Cassandra was not sure whether or not the sudden disinterest in the affair was offensive. She certainly did not mind the absence of all demanding things. Even the simple yearnings of life, such as her hunger, had been temporarily satiated. Markener had gone off to entertain himself among others. Her mother had become lost in a conversation with Nesu, who had hovered almost the entire time behind the throne like a vulture, hungry for her company and incapable of finding some solace or diversion until they were speaking again. He was smiling. It was disturbing. Osmara was laughing. At least they were enjoying themselves. Tarakan, however, looked frightfully lonesome. Cassandra was not surprised. Almost no one present in the great hall would have actively addressed such a common warlock. His place was behind the throne, ignored and not involved in the affairs of state whence most of these guests arrived. For her, those hours were lessons in diplomacy and dictatorship. For him, they were the quiet moments where he could crack open the leather volume and scan the pages for some other place to be, some other adventure to have, or at least that is how she liked to think he spent his time. She laid her utensils across her plate, still puddled with grease, stood and stepped down from the high table. Unnoticed by the assembled, she stalked up behind the captain. The tingling trace of her fingertips against his back sent shivers down his spine, and violently he was yanked out of his comatose. He turned and yelped. "Cassandra, what is it?" She dropped to the cold marble floor, choosing to sit on her bare hip instead of a pillow. "I saw you sitting here and thought you looked about as bored as I was." He chuckled. "Well, after such an astounding performance, I'm afraid to say nothing else has caught my attention." He pressed the crystal flute to his lips, but he hesitated, then offered the glass to the princess. She pressed the drink back and laughed. "Oh, no. 2 Venetian chagrins is enough for me. I will die if I have another sip. Come on, let's get out of here." The options were not comforting. If he refused, then Cassandra would go alone, and he would have to deal with Osmara. Accepting her invitation, however, was guaranteed to be almost as dangerous. With suicidal resolve, he knocked back his drink and stood up. He felt heavy as soon as he swallowed, and it took him a moment to right himself as he became more sensitive to his weight. The warm blue froth filled every emptiness in him with a dense, hot frenzy. His tongue was washed in waves of every flavor. Every perfume suddenly wafted intensely, every color sharply crisped and contrasted. He shivered and shrugged to escape the static tingle of his silk tunic, abrading his suddenly sensitive skin. The microscopic hairs along his wrists stood on end, desperate for stimulation. Cassandra snatched at his wrist and yanked him behind her. The hypersensitivity resulting from the last swallow faded as quickly as it came, and Tarakan replaced the regrettably empty glass goblet to the table before letting the princess escort him from the hall. 2 shadows stained the golden beam that stretched across the garden. Tarakan dropped the curtain after he and Cassandra passed through, and the light from the hall was immediately consumed by the black of night. Granulated shadows danced while their eyes adjusted to the dim light of twinkling stars and a full silver moon. The air was warm and sweet, but not in the way that the Venetian chagrin had been. This was subtle and refreshing. A slow tinkering symphony played around them as the pooled rainwater drained down the garden's decorative masonry. Cassandra's splashy steps led the way, descending the stairs and dancing along the walk. Tarakan followed her, moving around the flooded fountain, green with algae, to the edge of the garden where a short stone balustrade was all that stood between them and the craggy black shafts of rock that dove from the high cliff edge into the splashing southern Twin Lake. From here they could see clear across the twinkling waves, almost to where the cliffs of Taberlion sank into the horizon. Distant, achy moans bellowed back and forth at one another. Selkies were hunting. Cassandra took a seat on the granite bench and ignored the chill of the puddle that soaked into her skirt. Tarakan joined her, and together they stared over the lake and into the night. The storm had come much sooner than they had predicted, and left the sky spotted with remnant clouds, like children who dawdled after their mother. They hung so low against the dome of stars that it was easy to imagine scratching their nimbus underbellies with nothing more than an extended hand, but Cassandra and Tarakan had both tried too many times before to want to fail again. Cassandra laid her head on Tarakan, who was leaned back with his palms pressed against the stone seat. "I'm sorry," Cassandra broke the silence. "I should not have gotten you involved in all of this. I've been feeling so ridiculed and faulty and wanted something to pick on, somebody that I could nag and devalue. Then you came riding along, and I was so sure that nothing could put you in danger. Melanie, though, she told me what the others were saying. I never thought about how dangerous I was. I'm sorry that I put you through this. This was not part of the adventure I had planned. Terracon wanted to be patient with her remorse. You are a witch. I am a warlock. We are not humans, and we both should have known better. How about we simply blame this on youth and forget it ever happened? So we are still friends? Cassandra's mood lightened significantly. I'm not sure. Friends would not keep secrets from one another. Friends should already know their friends' secrets without having to be told, she teased. Oh, what's my secret? That you have not had as many adventures as you claim to have had, Cassandra accused. Terracon shook his head shamefully. Oh, princess, every time I have to chase you down, I have a better adventure than all of the other nights recorded on the tapestries that line these walls. Of course, if you are planning your adventure, then maybe my chases do not count. I mean, who plans her adventures before she starts them? He mocked. Cassandra scoffed and slapped playfully at his shoulder. He smiled. The narrow golden beam that stretched across the garden sheathed itself in the shadows for a second time. Do you see what I mean, Nesu? Whatever am I going to do with her? Nesu leaned in for another glance, shifting the drapery only enough to peek. Well, it is clear that they are bonding. Her eyes glint when she is near him, Osmara mourned. Your eyes glinted too, Nesu accused as he turned away from the curtain. The weight of Osmara's eyes turned her whole head as they rolled. Oh, Nesu, ours was just a spurt of lust. Nesu groaned, discomforted with Osmara's proposed clarity on the matter. He certainly did not presume to be as sure of her feelings. Well, perhaps this is nothing more. They walked away from the garden's arcade and down another hall which led back to the feast. It is clear that we cannot afford to have them gallivanting around. She is too young, his duties are too numerous, and it will only make things awkward for them later. Why not take some severe measure to distract them from one another? Osmara's eyes suddenly fired with ingenuity. Merkener. Oh, heavens no, Osmara, Nesu sneered. That is too severe. If you get him involved, you will lose all three in the process. Merkener and Cassandra were arguing earlier today, and Merkener said I could punish her by keeping them together. Osmara was clearly deep in thought. Her wrinkled fingers jabbed at the idea that percolated around her. There are many things he is not gifted with, but knowing how to strike our chords is one he has mastered. If I force them closer, then she will at some point try to get away. I could have them betrothed. Osmara, Nesu scorned. Just hear me out, the queen said while affectionately weaving her arm around his. We have both seen how fiery she gets when anybody tries to restrain her. Why not tie her down and let her escape on her own? She's guaranteed not to return to the matter. Nesu sighed as they came back to the great hall. He leaned into the curve of the doorway and surveyed the cupbearers as they lugged decanters from glass to glass. And what if she does not resist? Nesu posed. She should not have entertained his comment. So what if her eyes did glint? Their past was painted with unforgiven misunderstandings, and although they had become accustomed to their current stations, Nesu agonized over her freedom. Her answer would reinforce or forgive the opinion he held of her since their own youth. She scowled, and her lips, already sagging from age, seemed to slip even further down her face. He was such a devil. Then we shall let them be,